thank you all for joining us for this panel. You've been promised it's an interesting panel, and I can't promise that it will be at all, but we'll do our best. I'm with, as you know, Ambai, Jingjie, and Rajorshi Chakraborti, respectively a writer in Tamil, a Chinese researcher in literature, and a novelist who lives in New Zealand right now. All wonderful people, and I thought this is quite in a way, this is kind of an explosive discussion because it touches on two things that are very close to people. One is the idea of what is a classic, what is a good book. And the second thing, which is also elemental to people, is what do you love? You know? And when you tell people, for example, who love horror movies that there are better movies, or who love detective novels that there are better novels, I think people feel judged, and they feel that what they love is being judged. At the same time, people who love literature also want that love to be respected in some way, even in a world where it isn't necessarily. So I think it would be interesting to get at both of these kinds of issues when we talk today. So I thought I'd start off very quickly with just a couple definitions of what a classic is, from which I'm going to borrow from Italo Calvino, who has a great list of 14 reasons that we should read the classics, so 14 properties, all of which are really the same property. So here are some of them. He says, we use the word classics for books that are treasured by those who have read and loved them, but they are treasured no less by those who have the luck to read them for the first time. Classics are books that exert a peculiar influence, both when they refuse to be eradicated from the mind and when they conceal themselves in the folds of memory, camouflaging themselves as collective or individual unconsciousness. And the last thing I'll quote is, the classics are books which when we read them, we find them even fresher, more unexpected, and more marvelous than we had thought from hearing about them. So maybe I'll start with you, Liu. Firstly, do you agree with Calvino? And can you think of a moment in literature that has this feeling for you, something you recur to often and that seems to have more meaning than is exhausted in a single reading?
First I still want to say something that I'm really excited to be invited to the Bangalore Literature Festival. Talking about this, how classic give me that special feeling. Well, I think when I read some books, I think maybe all of you have this kind of feelings that the books just touch your heart, and some words are just so right. I have a poor memory to remember the exact words of all the classics, but I do remember that feeling. It's like I usually make a very kind of a not so adequate, not so proper comparison. So it's like you feel itchy in your back, you know, and you cannot touch it exactly the place. And then someone just came over and they just put out their hand and they just scratch it. And that's the point. And you will say, oh, that's it. So I think those literature, the good literature, the good literary fiction, they just give you this feeling. That's it, the feeling. And it also inspired me a lot. So I wanted to change my thoughts that the fixed thoughts before. So I want to change it. It's like my mind was open. That's what my.
Wow, that's a hard expression to follow. That captures so much of what I feel as well about great writing. But we all have our list of personal classics in mind, many of which we'll have in common, like the Mahabharata or the Ramayana or other stories and novels. But and then many individual ones which resonate with our experiences, and less well-known ones, but they resonated with us, and the way she expresses how they affect us, I could not better. What I will say though is that, and this is a part of the conversation that I'll come back to later on hopefully, is that I'm somebody formed by reading. I'm somebody formed by reading, and even the way, not just my mind and my writing as a writer, but also the way I look at people. And the way I've learned to look at people, I realize how much of that I owe to fiction. fiction taught me how to see more in people and how to be always looking for more in people. To pay better attention to people, I learnt it in the laboratory of fiction. But, and this is the part where I'll come back to the question of it being endangered, even someone like me, who was formed by his reading, who has what the Americans call skin in the game, that I have a vested interest in people reading because I'm a writer myself, even I find myself reading less than I would like to and reading less than I used to. And I'll come back to that. So,
I don't know, I feel that for me a classic text is something that when you read it and leave it, and when you come back, a text waits for you. It's not gone away because it's there in your mind. That's a classic for me. And many of modern fiction in Tamil have done this to me. And I can go back to them again and again. About whether such good reading, good fiction is endangered. I don't know about it because I feel that when I write, I'm not exactly worried about who is reading it. I write because I feel I'm compelled to write. I want to write, and that's why I write. And I really don't bother about who is reading it. Because I know that when my first collection of short stories came in 1976, it was not reviewed for 10 years. Nobody reviewed it. I didn't know whether anybody had read it. So my second collection came out in 1987. Because meanwhile I was doing a lot of other things, you see. And this thing about who is reading it, it must have affected my publisher also. Because meanwhile terminologies of fiction had changed. They had started using certain terms like experimental fiction. Just like you say, experimental theatre, for a slightly different kind of writing. And also there were certain attitudes that women were supposed to write only in particular ways, So they were in this book which came out in 1987, which is called A Kitchen in the Corner of the House. There are 4 stories in which you can say there are what they say women protagonists. Although in my stories there are no protagonists as such. Then there were 9 stories which didn't have any protagonists. They were about a yellow fish. One story was about a pig. One story was about eggs. And one story was about a river. Now this publisher who is a friend of mine, he has to put me in a category that is read, you see. So what he wrote in the blurb was that these are stories about women. So there are only 4 stories about women. What does it do with the 9 stories which are not about women? So he says, there are also some experimental stories in this collection, So I told him that I don't experiment with stories, And in Tamil, the word for experiment is shodhani. But shodhani is also the word we use for torture, So I told him that you can say that I torture people by writing, but you can't say experiment. But then there is no category called literature that tortures, you see. So he had to say that it's experimental. Then I fought with him so much that in the next he changed the blurb. And meanwhile he told me, that even if a man had written this stories, I would have called it the same, I told him, you're wrong. Just previous year, published a male writer, one of our best writers, where from the first story, where a 3-year-old child, male child, falls into the well, till the last story, all the stories were about men. I said, you never wrote that. This is a story about men. You never wrote that. You wrote, these are stories about life. So I said, when men write, even about men, it becomes universal, you see. When women write only 4 stories about women, it becomes particular and other stories become experiments. After all, we changed the love in the second issue. So these categories of what is being read, whether it's a thriller, whether it's mythological, whether it is stories about women, these are not things that should really bother a writer. I don't know if fiction is endangered and whether anybody is going to read me, but I shall continue to write. And if it is endangered, it's just too bad because I was just planning to read you.
Sorry, can I just check? Can you hear okay? Because it's a bit difficult to tell from the stage. You can hear okay? Okay, good. Ambai, you bring up a really important issue. I was thinking, what are the 3 reasons that it's quite, well, at least 3 reasons that it's hard to talk about literary fiction anymore as a category. The first one I can think of is obviously the rise of the internet, which has eclipsed other kinds of cultural production. The second is our uncomfortableness with making distinctions of high and low or good and bad fiction. But the third, and I think we probably all agree about this, all 3 of you exemplify this process, is the recognition that what is a classic can no longer just simply be a male phenomenon or phenomenon of writers in European languages. And I wondered what you think about that as a reason to rethink the idea of literary fiction or the classic. I'm happy for anybody to start.
I wanted to start by, I just wanted to respond first of all to the first point Imran made, which is about the rise of the internet, and the high and low is a distinction between high and low genres, and our reluctance to make them now is also a wonderful point. But one of the things I want to say is that we actually live in an incredibly changed time, and I cannot emphasize that enough. Sometimes I think that the ease and comfort with which we use our handheld devices for a million different reasons, and how comfortable we are and how seamlessly they have integrated into our personal lives, it actually hides, it masks the extent to which they have disrupted so many aspects of our world. And for today's purpose, I'm going to focus first of all on our working world. In thinking, I've had this topic about literary fiction being an endangered species and had come up with some things to say. And then in the course of conversations yesterday, I came to the conclusion that this new world we live in, this of digital communications and digital technologies, has actually disrupted everything to such an extent that every profession that my generation grew up expecting to step into is actually unrecognizable. And in some ways, it's financially unviable. Whether it's advertising, it's been dramatically changed. Journalism, to get paid for in-depth, courageous reporting, to get paid even to do the research, let alone to feed yourself and look after your family, has been dramatically disrupted. So how can one of the oldest acts of human literacy, which is reading the printed page, survive unchanged in this dramatically disrupted ecosystem? So, literary fiction and how much attention we pay to it and how we can read it is only one thing that has been dramatically affected by this world we live in. So for example, like we were talking about yesterday, there are long articles that people produce for which in Britain they get paid in The Guardian, for which they get paid apparently £125, which is really not much to produce a 4,000 word well-researched article. So I think that's one thing that we have to look at. The wider environment in which we all live has been dramatically disrupted. And so one thing within that, what I want to say are causes for optimism for me, is that I feel there's still a great hunger for complexity and for complex stories. And one proof of that is people's love in many countries for long-form drama. You know, whether it's shows like Breaking Bad or The Sopranos or The Wire in the English-speaking world, which unfold like rich novels in many cases, and people love that and stay hooked and watch it through a whole night sometimes, you know? So there's a great hunger still for stories. Now you might say, but that's visual, and we have become a very visual culture. Well, another thing I'd say is, sometimes this hunger for stories can be satiated just with words. For example, we are living in a golden age of the podcast. In many countries, on their way to work, in a commute that in a city like Bangalore can take a long time, if you're not the actual driver, you can make that time really rich by listening to a story, a very complex, rich story, through mere words as a podcast. So, the signs as a writer that still give me a lot of hope is there is still a hunger for stories, there is still a great hunger for complexity. The one area of traditional literature that I feel, and this is the part that I was linking to my own reading list, that I feel might be in trouble, is, you know what it is? I feel it is not stories, not characters, and not complexity, but it is demanding prose that is, or writing that is challenging to read for a great length of time. So not even poetry in some ways, like people can give their attention to a relatively short poem that makes a great impression. But I feel we have become, on the one hand, so easily distracted because there is so much to look at. Our phones are always offering us an easy escape into a new distraction. Click on a link, see what status updates there are, move to something else. So perhaps it's because there are so many distractions, and also because phones are such a smooth and easy interface. You know, like I've been in Bangalore, my brother who I'm staying with orders cabs, orders breakfast with these apps, and they just appear by magic. And it's just there. 4 minutes, the cab is here. Yesterday, steaming idlis appeared using Swiggy, you know? And we booked plane tickets. So in that environment where all around us, every interface is so easy to use, a writer using one long, demanding sentence after another that asks you to concentrate, asks you to pay attention for the length of a novel, might be one part of literature that is under threat. That's just, please challenge me. I'm playing the devil's advocate.
I forget what we were talking about now completely.
Can I share something? Actually, I totally agree with Raj. Actually, on the first night I arrived, I ordered KFC from the KFC India app. So you see, our life was totally unchanged, right? We're largely influenced by the internet and by all the social media. So should we really set us opposite, or set literary fiction opposite to that trend? The other days when I'm thinking about this topic, I did some research. I actually come over reading a very funny and hilarious essay. The title is How to Write a New York Times Bestseller in 10 Steps. Okay, so it's really funny. But there are some points that really interest me, and it could be say it's true for today's bestsellers. So I remember very clearly, the first point is that you write a cliche story, right? You repeat, nowadays we have some chicklet, you call it chicklet, that repeating the Cinderella fairy tales for millions of times. And the second point is about making the internet presence, establish an internet presence. That means to make yourself famous on the social media, like on Twitter, like on like Facebook. According to the writer said, if you have 2,000 followers, you are ready to have a book deal. And in China we do not have Facebook and Twitter, but we do have a Chinese version of Twitter and Facebook. We have Weibo and WeChat. And nowadays, actually a lot of bookshops and a lot of publishing houses and even libraries, even writers or literary magazines, they were using the social media to encourage people to read. Can I give an example? We have comparatively a young publishing house. It's called Guangxi Normal University Press. It's young. It's only established in 1986. But since 2003, this publishing house, they established a brand name called Imaginist, and they started publishing a lot of award-winning books. But then, in 2015, this press, he observed that how social media influenced us, right? So they started to shift their focus from print media to include digital media. And they set up called the Wistopia. It's based on utopia. It's Wistopia. It's like a digital media platform. And on this digital media platform, they invited a lot of famous writers and some very important intellectuals nowadays in China. They did make a short TV program. It's very, very nice, according to the cinematography. It's very nice about literature and art. And it's set on our online video platform. It's called Youku. It's a Chinese version of YouTube. So actually, quite soon, they established a very huge audience online. And this program is just introduce the very important books or the literary and the philosophical classics. And with watching these programs, and a lot of people, they know about those literary works. And they started to buy those books, to read those books. So I think from this example, just as Raj said, we can cope with this trend, not to set us opposite to this trend.
I think what it all boils down, what you have spoken, it boils down to time. How much time do we allot to reading or listening to something we like? How much time are we willing to give? It always happens. I run a women's archives. So sometime in August, some young girl will ring me up and she'd say that, do you know any freedom fighter who lives in Bombay? And I would say, yes, I know. Then she would say that, do you know someone who lives in Colaba? I would ask why? Because I live in Colaba and I have to submit the story in 1 hour. So it will be easier for me if she lives in Colaba. I can just go and meet her, write the story. I said, this woman will be in her 80s, you see. You can't go and disturb her whenever you want, And so I'm sorry, I can't give you the names, So they want everything done in a specific time. Or somebody would write to me and tell me that I would like to ask you some questions about your stories. So then I'll write back and ask, how many stories of mine have you read? She'll say, none. So how can you ask me questions? All women writers are asked the same question. What are the women's issues you write about? What time, where do you write? What space do you write? These are the questions they'll ask any writer. Now, yesterday I received a Proustian questionnaire from an Italian publisher. What makes you happy? What makes you sad? I said, this you can ask anyone. You don't have to ask a writer. So I think it's a matter of time. And I feel that what the world is really engaged in now, because of the easy availability, is they are dealing with information which can be downloaded. But I don't think knowledge can be downloaded. And it's just not possible to download knowledge. And I would like to think that in the act of writing, what I'm dealing with is the way I relate to what I consider truth in my life and in what is surrounding me. And if I have to give that as 10 pieces of information in 750 words, I might as well stop writing. But how does one deal with a situation where people don't have time to read you? It has happened in my own family. The younger generation in my family does not read Tamil. And they don't have time for translated English stories either. So I asked my niece, who is going to read me in my family, I said that you won't be able to read me, we don't give time. So she said, but it is no loss. By not reading you, I'm not losing anything. I said that you will know what you're losing only when you read me. How can you say no loss without reading me? You first read me and then tell me whether it will be a loss if you don't read me. So I feel that it's a matter of how we teach people to create time. And I know that when computers came in, many Tamil writers began to write on the computer directly, And it was easy in certain ways, but it also made certain things very different. Because stories which we will write in 10 pages became stories of 20 pages. Because you can keep on writing on the computer, you don't have to pause, you can do many things. But I still write in a notebook, and when I then feed it into the computer, it changes a little bit. So it's a question of how we teach others and how we teach ourselves, how we are going to deal with time. Like in Sparrow, we have made life stories of women as documentaries. We call them oral history documentaries. They are all 1 hour and 2 hours. And then when we show it in college in Bombay, they ask us, can it be reduced to half an hour? Because our students don't have attention after half an hour. I said, well, that is just too bad. Because we can't reduce it. I can't reduce a woman's life into half an hour, which is entertaining for you, These are oral history documentaries are not made for entertainment. I said, you have to ask time, then you come and watch it in the archives. I'll show it to you. If you don't have that time, you don't have to know about this woman. You will not miss anything. So it's a question of how we treat time and how we teach others around us to deal with time, for what they should give time and for what they should not, And I think both of you are so much younger, so you are talking about podcast and listening to stories and other things, I don't like to listen to stories at all. I like to listen to music. But I find that when I listen to a story being read, my mind wanders. I used to sing along with my mother, then I lost my voice. So sometimes when I go and have to read my stories, I tell people that, I have a bad voice, and somebody else read my stories. Then in smaller audiences, they always tell me, we want you to read your story in your broken voice. only then we will know what it is. So I feel that voice and so many things are important, And I don't think we can do away with all this just because people don't have time,
Can I just respond to it? I think she I think she captures so many things so perfectly. I mean, think about how people use podcasts. They do it while they are multitasking. So they're multitasking. They're driving, they're commuting, they're doing so they feel very virtuous. I'm using my time really well. I'm kind of accomplishing two things at once, and that's why I said that. The one thing that suffers in that is, and podcasts are continued, the one thing that suffers is complex textured sentences, which require you to pause, go back, reflect on what is said, and that has suffered. Maybe each sentence taking the story forward, adding more information. People who happen to write in that style will prosper in our time and are prospering. But writers whose sentences demand that you slow down, and sometimes I feel in today's world that is one of the greatest gifts we can give one another that Ambai is talking about, which is not just with our reading, but the time and the attention we pay to one another. People feel amazed that someone is paying attention to me and listening and looking rather than suddenly looking at their phone again or whatever. But one thing I wanted to add is that I am younger than Ambai, and I want to keep writing, and like Ambai I feel, and no matter how dismal the sales of my books, I feel an irrepressible urge to keep writing. So I have to find the positives and hold on to those signs of hope and find reasons to keep writing. And I think no matter what, any writer who publishes, not writers who write and then just keep it for themselves, that is a legitimate, absolutely legitimate need. But writers who do choose to try and publish, send their work into the wider world, do have some hope of reaching an audience, reaching a readership. So I think the one thing this new ecosystem that I live in has forced me to be more aware of, even in the 15 years that I've been writing, I've become more aware, which is, of getting the balance right in between writing as an act of self-expression, authentic, complex self-expression, writing which is as truthful and as complex as I can make it, but also at the same time writing as an act of communication, writing with one eye on holding a reader's interest. Because today I've become so aware of all the things that are competing with my story for that reader's interest. That reader is being, to get that balance right, like sometimes the way I think of it, the positive way I think of it, writing as an act of communication, like many other acts of communication. For example, lovemaking. I often tell my creative writing students who talk about writing sex scenes to think of sex scenes as a subspecies of communication scenes and miscommunication scenes and failures of communication scenes in which so much is going on. But I think of, these days I think of the act of writing itself as similar to lovemaking. For example, if there was a very narcissistic, athletic lovemaker who was focused on pumping in and out with no eye on whether the person he was making love to was even responding, that would be a failure. That would not be lovemaking, that would be something else. It would be a complete failure. So I think of writing much more these days as aspiring to a midway point where I try to express myself as truthfully as possible and want to give the reader an experience that is worthy of their time and attention, for which I'm very grateful. But at the same time, what I expect from them is that openness, that they will also come and meet me halfway with their attention open to discovering something new, and that is the kind of ideal that I try and write to.
Can I also see a small point? Just to listen to Ambai's talk, I'm thinking what I'm just mentioned about the dystopia. I feel like there are some problems with this kind of programs as well, because these programs, they were just to take the perspective from that intellectual, from that writer's perspective. So it's kind of like implant a preconception into the potential reader's mind. I think what is more important is that we first read it, and then we have this kind of reflection or the feelings, and then we can communicate, just as what you said. So I'm a teacher of literary courses. So what I'm really enjoying teaching is like I ask my students to read it first, and then we can talk, we can discuss in class. I think that's also the beauty of literature. Yes.
Let me ask you about two additional feelings apart from love and lovemaking, although it was a very useful lesson. Nadine Gordimer said that as a young woman, she was actually very free to write in South Africa. She described it as an open secret that she was a writer, because absolutely nobody cared. And she found a kind of freedom in that indifference. And to some extent, many of us as writers find an indifferent world, and I wonder what virtues you see in that. And then my second question is, even before the internet, in fact, I remember a conversation in 1991. This is not particularly about Toni Morrison, but a teacher whom I really liked came to me and he said very softly, "Don't tell anybody this, but I'm actually not that crazy about Toni Morrison." And he was very, worried that I would actually commit. And I said, "No, I'll keep you a secret." But I wonder, as writers and readers, when people tell us to believe something, you must love this book and whatever, my inclination is to ask. Writing to some extent starts in doubt. So does us reading. And I wonder to what extent are there individual cases where you're skeptics about literary greatness or canonization and how you deal with them, and then other instances where you have absolute faith in a particular book or its guiding qualities. Let's start with anybody. In fact, Lua, maybe we can start with you, because I wondered if this question about greatness is a different question to ask in China with such, and obviously, and also like India, with such an established tradition, an established criteria of evaluation.
For me, I think even though I'm not really the expert in the Chinese literature, I'm doing English and Asian American literature. But I think the criteria, the standards for the classic works, they are like universal. Yeah, I don't really think there's a certain tradition that is specific to Chinese literature. But as you mentioned about the love of the literary works, that you mentioned that professor did not dare to mention that he did not like Toni Morrison. Yes, that coming back to the question about the highbrow and the lowbrow readings. I remember quite clearly that once I've been talking with certain professors from a prestigious American college, and there's an English professor. So when she asked, she said, "Ginger, which book is your favorite book?" So I think, suddenly I just think about what I really love in my childhood. My grandmother read to me, David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. I really like it, so I say, "Oh, I love David Copperfield by Charles Dickens." And that professor just looked at me and said, "Oh, so maybe think like Charles Dickens' works are too like a commercial bestseller in the past, not worthy mentioning as a really classic." So I've been thinking about, do we really need to draw a line, a straight line between the literary fiction and the commercial bestseller? Because we can see there are some commercial bestsellers which survive the time, which last forever as classics. So I've been thinking about this problem. Yes.
And just to add to what Jingjie just said, and to respond to Imran's question, one thing that is very important to it's very important to question these received values of what your society tells you, or your culture tells you, or your teacher tells you is great literature. And I think highbrow literature can be as lazy and have its own bad habits that it just falls into. And we all know about disappointing books by big names, where we pick up their latest books and we just go, no, this time you didn't pay attention. You fell into an imitation of yourself. Whereas, so whereas there are, yeah. So what I want to distill it. We're running out of time, and others will speak. For me, a criteria when I'm watching something or when I'm reading something is, and it can be anything. It can be a crime novel. It can be a novel centered on a romance. It can be is whether there is a genuine effort to. You can feel it. You can feel it in the lines, in moments, and those moments start to accumulate. They start to add up. Whether there is a genuine effort to illuminate, to shed light, whether there is a genuine effort, a palpable effort to connect, and whether there is a genuine effort to search, to go somewhere different. Not, even in connecting, Ginger and I were talking about one of the differences between what I would call formulaic writing or formulaic filmmaking and writing and filmmaking that is trying for something different is, even within all writers, I think, would hope to be told, dream of being told that you connected with the reader's heart. But there are different ways and different levels at which you can connect with the reader's heart. Advertisers know this, politicians know this, filmmakers and writers also know this. There is in every reader's heart, in my heart, there is low-hanging fruit. The fruit that is most easily picked. Very, very easy sentiments that you can aim for. And books aim for that, films aim for that. As I said, politicians and advertisers aim for that. So I want my heart to be touched by a book, but I want, when I feel that the writer is asking me to climb the tree a bit higher, because there's more interesting fruit a bit higher up. If you come with me, I'm going to take you to an even more interesting place. That view is really interesting, but it's a very obvious beauty. But come with me. There's a more unusual beauty. And for me, a book or a film that is trying to uncover unusual beauties, strange beauties, is a book that I will stay with, no matter what genre it is in or whether the writer is famous or not.
You guys are a very inspiring panel, by the way. We only have 15 minutes left, so I wondered if we could take some questions and then you could respond to them. Is that good with you guys?
Just two things. And I think it was in one of the books of Boris, it's called Labyrinths, where a person decides that he was going to rewrite a classic text entirely. I don't know if you remember that story. So he sits down and he rewrites the entire classical text. And he finds, and when he checks, there is not a word changed, So I feel that there are ways in which we can rewrite in a totally different generation and still arrive at the same text. It's possible, That's one thing. And another thing about readership, I'll just give you a small incident. It was an old theatre person in Bombay, and he was a solo performer, and he wanted to perform one play, and he had taken a theatre for hire, but he wasn't sure he was going to get an audience. So he asked a painter friend that, will you come to watch me perform? He said, yes, I'll definitely come. And he was there. So he did his entire performance for his friend. Then he said that I'm so happy you came. So the painter friend told him, actually I bought the tickets for the entire theatre today. And only I came, but I bought the tickets, So he said, that's good. That means I had a full house, he said. So I feel that even if one reader reads you, you can feel that many have read you. That's the way, maybe you don't even have to tell him these are the fruits I'll take you to. He will reach, or he or she would reach there herself, and there won't be any need. So I like to go with the feeling that there is always a full house, and not to lose hope.
Great. So it's going to be difficult to manage questions, but maybe we could take a few from people who have them. Would you put your hand up and we'll... Is there someone to give people a microphone? No? Yeah. There's someone. Will someone come to you with the microphone?
Hi, Rajorshi. I just Googled you, so I'm not a great fiction reader as such, and I don't read fiction a lot. And what you said really interested me, so I Googled you, and I don't understand. I mean, a book called A Half Girlfriend or whatever it is. I mean, written by Chetan Bhagat. I mean, I don't know how it could sell so many books, and I haven't read anything of you. I mean, you truly, are a very sensible person, and what you've said right now really is inspiring. I don't know. I mean, probably you should have been an ex-financial banker who has just given up his financial banking, and you need something like that to keep the audience going to read their books. Otherwise, probably you're just going to be history, I suppose. Unless you come to these literary festivals and enlighten us.
I just, I live in the modern day equivalent of retiring to the Himalayas because I live in New Zealand. And whenever I ask, there's two groups of people. When I say I live in New Zealand, there's two immediate responses, both of which are in one word. One group says, wow. The other group says, why? It's really, so, but I think that's part of that's definitely contributes to my invisibility. But no, one thing I want to say is, I think Ambai's, that beautiful thought about even one reader being moved by this constitutes a successful act of communication. As this, I take this disruption maybe because of the generation I'm in, and because, as I said, I want to be writing and I'm committed to this medium, but I also want to think about the world in which I'm writing. I think about the effects of this disruption to such an extent that it has made me rethink or go back to the basics of what is storytelling and why do we do it, And one of the very simple definitions of stories is, for me, a personal definition is a story is a thread that kind of runs through people and the worlds they live in. And in doing so, stories shed heat or warmth, and stories shed light. They shed light on that world and on that person, and they shed warmth that perhaps touches a reader, invites a reader in. So, for me, I've begun questioning things and building my own reasons for writing from that very basic level, But what I want to say about being at a Lit Fest is one of the aspects of being a writer is very rarely do you get the opportunity to see the effect that your words have on a reader. Because by definition, reading on the printed page is often a very solitary act. The writer writes and then the reader reads somewhere far away. Rock stars don't have this problem. Rock stars see an immediate reaction in their audience and they thrive off it, and there's a mutual kind of exchange. So for someone like me to attend literary festivals and see this incredible enthusiasm and interest, where we have tried to speak with the utmost complexity. We have not tried to simplify anything, and yet I'm so delighted to see that very few people left and walked away. People stayed, which shows me that there is such an interest, such a hunger for ideas, for complex conversation. So thank you all very much.
Hi, my name is Aditya. You guys are really inspiring, and I am an occasional book reader. I am also a Quora reader and a writer. So my question to you is, there is a question that is doing the rounds on Quora these days, that by an anonymous questioner. It's I read certain books every year, and I've read close to 100 books. It's a question from the reader, not from me, that I've read close to 100 books, and I just keep forgetting the previous books I've written. I've read, and so there are certain people who have written answer on it, that what is the utility or what is the use of reading so many books. So what will be your take on it? Like, if you are going reading about books, how do you just remember the books, or do you just take the lessons and move on? Thank you.
That's a good question. I think that what you're talking about is really whether the effort of reading, the effect should be immediate, that you should remember it in such a way that it will last forever. I think that reading is not an act like that at all. There is no immediacy about it. Sometimes you read a book and you may even forget it, but suddenly someday you're traveling in a train or a bus or something and you remember a line. So I feel reading is like that. It's not a question about remembering. You may remember the title, you may forget the title, you may forget the name of the writer, but there is something that has happened in that act of reading which will remain with you, which you need not discover, but sometimes it will come to you on its own.
All right, Rajorshi, I have a question for you. You talked about low-hanging fruit and how you should probably try to strive higher for a better view, right? Which I thought was great. This might be a bit prosaic, but go ahead, humor me for a second, all right? So, can you give me an example of a book that you read?
That has low-hanging fruit.
No, which spurred you to reach, greater heights with the prose.
I mean, every book that I think this has brought us full circle to the conversation, which is, we started with the idea of what constitutes a classic, and I think every book that made you come alive and respond to it on multiple dimensions is an example of that, and each of our lists would differ. That I was moved on many levels, some of which challenged each other. And what Ambai said, which is the process of reading transformed me. It made me come alive so what I think what you're asking me for is a kind of list of personal favorites, or
maybe just one.
But I would say Great Expectations. Definitely Great Expectations.
Thank you.
So, as speaking of
this informing panel, and Madam told that somebody asked her in US, and she told Charles Dickens, and I think we will also say the same thing. Do modern authors, especially young authors, have patience to write some classics, so that we can say that Charles Dickens, Great Expectations, or Crime and Punishment. So my question is whether modern author want short circuit route, or they have patience to write some classics which can be remembered even after 50 years or 100 years.
You mean modern writers, could they write classics? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. I think in the past, the classic writers, they are their modern writers, right? Yeah, so I think maybe 50 years ago, nowadays modern writers, they become classics, right? That's tough. You're a moderator, you can name one. Yeah, Ambai, yes. You're the...
I'm not ready even now, after 50 years. Maybe when you drive the car, somebody will be reading my story to you.
Okay, good. So we found two classics, David Copperfield and Ambai. Thank you so much for clapping. Thank you so much to my audience.
Fine, thank you. Thank you so much. Please, a round of applause for the most endearing panel we've had on stage. Just wonderfully human people. Thank you so much for joining us on stage.
Thank you. Thank you.